Okay, so what we're going to be doing today is we are going to start up on Chapter 5. And in Chapter 5, we're going to continue with our look at classical conditioning. So we've been spending a lot of time on classical conditioning. That is because it is one of the two main forms of learning that organisms use, humans including. So classical conditioning is one of the big ones. Operational conditioning is the other one. We're going to get to that soon, but we got to keep going on classical conditioning. And today we're going to take a look at more underlying processes and more practical applications. So to begin with, we've seen Pavlov's dog a few times so far, and we know that if we pair the bell, which is a neutral stimulus, with the food, which is an unconditioned stimulus, and then the unconditioned stimulus causes salivation, the unconditioned response, that eventually that bell will change into a conditioned stimulus, which causes the conditioned response. And in this case, it's a conditioned response of salivation. So in this situation, the unconditioned response was salivation, the conditioned response was salivation. They were the same response. However, that doesn't always happen. So if we were training rats instead, and we had the unconditioned stimulus of a shock. There they are. We had the unconditioned stimulus of a shock. That would cause the unconditioned response of jumping. So if we set up this floor here to shock this rat, what would happen even before any training, before any conditioning? That rat would jump to try to avoid the shock. If we play the tone, that would be a neutral stimulus. It would cause no response. So in classical conditioning, what we would do is we would pair that tone with a shock, and the tone would be the neutral stimulus, followed by the shock, the unconditioned stimulus, and that would cause the unconditioned response of jumping. And then as conditioning went on, we would find that the tone has changed into a conditioned stimulus, no longer a neutral stimulus, but now it's a conditioned stimulus. So the unconditioned stimulus causes jumping, the unconditioned response. Our tone has now become a conditioned stimulus, and we know it's a conditioned stimulus because it causes freezing. What happened? That's completely different, right? So now the conditioned stimulus is causing freezing. Freezing is the complete opposite of jumping. So the unconditioned response was jumping to try to avoid the shock. The conditioned response is freezing. So what is the difference? Well, what is the reason for this? Why is the reason that sometimes your conditioned response is the same as your unconditioned response, and other times your conditioned response is the complete opposite of your unconditioned response? We're going to take a look at solving that with today's class. Also today, we're going to look at what I like to call the curious case of Robert Pattinson. So here's Robert Pattinson in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Has anybody seen this movie? All right, we got a few. All right, so here he is, and this was 2005, I believe. So here's Robert Pattinson, and here's another image of him playing Cedric Diggory, I believe. Fresh-faced, rosy cheeks. You know, look at that youngster there. And then 3 years later, he was in Twilight Saga. Some of you might have heard of that one as well. I see a lot of you shaking your head. I don't know if it was, I don't know if it's regret because he used to be in the Twilight Saga, but it is one of those ones that has not held up. Anyways, 3 years later, and he looked like this. So what happened to poor Robert Pattinson, right? This is 2005, that's 2008, all right? Fresh-faced, not so much. So we're going to take a look at why this might have happened to Robert Pattinson, what might have gone on, and we'll also tie this in to why is it that waiters and waitressing, being a waiter or a waitress, is a highly, highly stressful job. Why is being a telemarketer a highly, highly stressful job? And also, why would working for Darth Vader be a highly, highly stressful job? Or just any boss that is like Vader. We're going to see why, and it has to do with classical conditioning. So what we're going to look at today, we're going to take a look at discrimination training, We mentioned that before when we were looking at stimulus generalization. We have stimulus discrimination. But we're going to take a look at a new wrinkle, which is experimental neurosis. And then we're going to answer why some conditioned responses are the same as the unconditioned response, why some are different, when we take a look at preparatory response theory. And we'll wrap it all up, if we got time, with a look at Watson and Rayner's little Albert experiment, classic experiment on classical conditioning. All right, so Robert Patterson, what happened to this individual? To explain it, we're going to go back to a classic textbook example and talk about stimulus discrimination a little bit more. So we mentioned this in previous classes, that you can test a dog's sensory abilities. You can learn what different animals can and cannot perceive by going through discrimination training. So what you do in this case is you pick two stimuli, and one of those you pair with the unconditioned stimulus. So we would have a 2,000 hertz bell, neutral stimulus, pair that, so we present the bell, then present the food, the unconditioned stimulus. That leads to salivation, the unconditioned response. That's during conditioning. Also during conditioning, on random trials, you would present a 1900 hertz bell, which is also a neutral stimulus. But this one you would not pair with food. So you would go randomly back and forth between presenting the 2000 hertz bell, ding, 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 here's some food, dog salivates. Present the 1900 hertz bell, ding, 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 here's some food, the dog salivates, and you keep doing, here's no food, did that wrong. No food on the 1900 hertz tone, dog has no response. And what you will find is that after conditioning, if you ring the 2000 hertz bell, the dog will have the conditioned response of salivation. That 2000 hertz bell has become an excitatory conditioned stimulus. That causes the conditioned response. In addition to that, the 1900 hertz bell will become an inhibitory conditioned stimulus that will cause no response. So this is discrimination training. This is stimulus discrimination. And if you get this situation here, where the dog has a conditioned response to a 2000 hertz bell, but it has no response to the 1900 hertz bell, what that means is the dog can tell the difference between those two bells. Those two bells sound different to the dog, and that's how they measure often the perceptual capabilities of different animals. So stimulus discrimination is that, again, that tendency for a conditioned response to occur more for one stimulus than for another stimulus. So we have a conditioned response occurring for a 2000 hertz stimulus, conditioned response not occurring for that 1900 hertz stimulus. So far so good? All right. So if you are a scientist studying dogs, as these scientists were, once you get finished with this experiment here, the next thing you're going to ask yourself is, well, can they tell the difference when there's an even smaller difference between the two bells? And then if they do that, can they tell the difference if there's an even smaller, difference between the tones? And how small of a difference before they just reach their perceptual capabilities and they can no longer tell the difference? So what you might do is you might start saying, all right, well, let's do another session and we'll train a dog, 2000 hertz bell, neutral stimulus. So this is a new dog. 2000 hertz bell, neutral stimulus, food, unconditioned stimulus, causes salivation, the unconditioned response. So that's one training trial. Randomly interspersed is going to be a 2010 hertz bell, which at this point is a neutral stimulus that is paired with no food, so no unconditioned stimulus, and that leads to no response. So you repeatedly present 2000 hertz bell. Ding, 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 ding. Here's some food, salivation. 2010 hertz bell. Ding, 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 ding. Here's no food, no salivation. 2000, ding, ding, ding. 2010, ding, ding, ding. 2000, ding, 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 2010, ding, ding, ding. And if you keep doing that, and much like all of us, you cannot tell the difference between the two bells, what happens is you do not get stimulus discrimination. What you get is neurotic-like behavior. So dogs placed in this position, when you rang the bell by itself, when you were testing to see, oh, is it an excitatory conditioned stimulus? Is it an inhibitory conditioned stimulus? Rather than the dogs just sitting there going, I don't know. What happened is that they had neurotic-like behavior. These dogs looked anxious. They looked nervous. They started biting things. They started whimpering and lying down. They started doing other nervous. They started urinating all over the place. They just started doing things that a human would look at and say, that dog is looking a little neurotic. They're looking a little anxious. They have these neurotic-like behaviors. So this is called experimental neurosis, also known as experimentally induced neurosis. But it's called experimental neurosis, and it's a procedure or an experiment. You don't want to actually do this, but this is how you do it. But experimental neurosis is the product of being unable to differentiate between the two conditioned stimuli. So it's when it occurs more generally when you're exposed to unpredictable events. So notice that in this situation, this dog was being asked to tell the difference between two bells that he could not distinguish. So when that bell was rung, this dog did not know, am I getting food or am I not getting food? The previous dog heard one bell, ding, 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 and thought to themselves, oh, I'm getting food. I'm going to start salivating. Heard another bell, ding, 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 and thought to themselves, oh, I'm not getting food. All right, that's fine. This one here could not tell the difference. And because food was unpredictable, that dog led to these neurotic-like behaviors. That discrimination training led to these neurotic-like behaviors. And even before I remember becoming aware of this, I had actually created an experiment that mimicked this training, and it was when I was doing an experiment on facial recognition. So what the experiment entailed, here we go. This also is a conditioned stimulus that sometimes leads or makes me feel a little neurotic, because when I press this button, I don't know, is it going to advance? Is it not going to advance? Who knows? It's an adventure. All right, anyways. So what I did was, in this experiment, we wanted to know how much of a facial expression do you need before you can recognize an emotion, right? So if somebody's really sad, if they're like that, that's a lot of facial expression, and you can very easily say, okay, that person is sad. But if the person's just kind of like, you know, just a little, just a hint of sadness in their face, can you distinguish that? Can you discriminate between those emotions? So what we did in this experiment is we set up a neutral face, and we set up an emotional face, and we simply asked subjects to identify the emotional face. What is, you know, this emotion? So they would take a look at it and they would say, okay, that's sad, and that is, I believe that was fear. There's anger right there. There's disgust. No, that's fear. The other one was surprise. And then there's happiness. And what we would do is, if they got it right, we used the morphing program to morph between, let's say, 100% happy expression and a 0% neutral expression. And we would gradually decrease it. So if you could detect 100% happiness, the next time you saw it, it was 90%. And if you could detect 90%, the next time you saw it, it was 80%. And if you could detect 80%, it went down. And we were searching for those thresholds. We were searching for how much happiness do you need in the face before you can't do that anymore. Well, what eventually happens is you reach your limit, and you end up with faces that look like this. And we ask you, which of these, you know, what's this emotion? And students, subjects, by design, had difficulty. I mean, it was at the limit of their perceptual abilities. I have run countless experiments in my academic career that have basically all been, take a look at this stimulus and give me a rating, take a look at this stimulus, can you do this? And this was the only experiment where students came out agitated. It was the only experiment where when they came out, I heard heavy sighs of relief, and they were like, oh, I'm glad that's over. And I heard them, and they would tell me, they'd be like, you know what, I kind of feel a little antsy, I kind of feel a little anxious right now. And I did not know why. I was at that time thinking, you're looking at faces, what's the issue? It's a conditioned stimulus they can't tell the difference between. They can't predict, are you going to get it right, are you going to get it wrong? This you can predict. Yeah, I'm going to get this right. This, you can't. So that experience of not being able to tell the difference caused in them this induced experimental neurosis, and that's why they came out feeling anxious. The only experiment I've ever run where people felt anxious. And this ties into another reason why people are a little anxious around clowns. So being able to read facial expressions is very, very important in our society, because the facial expression predicts the encounter that you're going to have. If you see somebody walking up to you and they look like that, you know that you're probably in for a very pleasant encounter. If you say, hey, how are you doing? They're going to say, oh, I'm doing great. If you walk up to a person that looks like this, you know that something has just terrified them. You're able to predict it, right? So if you walk up to your friend and they look like that, you know what to do. You're able to predict what to do. You don't walk up to them and say, hey, how's it going? You walk up to them and say, what's wrong? Like, what did you see? Should we run? So being able to discriminate these emotions allows you to predict your behavior. That's why you usually don't feel anxious. When you're presented with a face like this, right, when we took a look at coulrophobia, this face presents competing information, and it makes it difficult to tell or predict what's going to happen. So this face over here, notice this makeup here, this is smiling. This is telling you that you're going to have one particular encounter. But look at the actual lips. The lips are straight across. That's telling you that you're going to have another encounter. And as much as your brain is having a hard time identifying this facial expression, because part of your brain is saying, oh, that's a happy clown. Part of your brain is saying, doesn't look so happy. Because of that inability to discriminate, you start to get those feelings of anxiousness. And that's part of the reason, we have like 3 reasons so far, I think. That's part of the reason why people sometimes feel a little angsty amongst clowns. And this is even exacerbated if you ever see like a clown as a character in a TV show or a movie, and they get sad. It makes me feel at least a little bit anxious, because they have this painted on smile, but their other face is clearly sad, and your brain is hard. It's harder for it to say, pay attention to the actual lips, don't pay attention to the makeup lips, and it has a hard time making a decision, and you feel a little bit angsty. Maybe that's why the Joker, who's getting his own movie coming out real soon, maybe that's why he's such a terrifying villain that puts people on edge, because he always has this smile, but you cannot predict what he's going to do. Because he's the Joker, he's unpredictable. So this unpredictability, this inability to distinguish between two stimuli to predict what's going to happen, this is the reason why waiters and waitressing is such a difficult occupation, because when you're bringing out that food, you didn't cook it, you didn't prepare it, and a steak that is cooked correctly on the outside looks like a steak that is cooked incorrectly often. So you don't know when you put it in there, the client, the customer cuts into it, if it's going to be, yay, awesome job, or if it's going to be, I want to talk to your manager, this is horrible. It's stressful because you cannot predict what's going to happen. Telemarketers, when they phone people, they cannot predict. if these people are going to be very interested to learn about that new internet plan or that new credit card line of credit that you're trying to sell, or if they're going to tell you to go away in some of the worst ways imaginable. So again, it's stressful because you cannot predict when a person says hello, what the outcome is going to be. That's a conditioned stimulus that is not predicting what the conditioned response should be. So again, very stressful, you get those neurotic-like behaviors. This is why you would never want to work on the Death Star. Darth Vader would be a horrible, horrible boss, not just because of his choking tendencies, but because of the fact that if you worked for Darth Vader, you would never know what mood he was in, right? So you might have seen this t-shirt. That's what you're going to be faced with every single day. And they have done studies that have shown that people's anxiety level at work is tied to not whether their boss is a really, really nice person necessarily, not whether their boss is a really horrible person, not whether their boss has a sunny disposition, not whether their boss is incredibly negative. What matters is, can you read your boss, and are they consistent with their facial expressions? Because if you can read that your boss is angry, then that's a discrimination. You can say, oh yeah, he looks angry, so I'm going to prepare myself in this way, versus, oh, he looks happy, maybe now's the time to ask for a raise. So if your boss is like that, it's going to be a lot easier than if your boss is very unexpressive, or worse, has inconsistent expressions. So if your boss is walking around with a smile on their face, and you walk up to them and you say, hey, how's it going? And they're like, horrible, it's a horrible day. That's a stressful work environment, because you can't predict what's going to happen based on their outcome. So Vader, never mind the choking, this is why most people would be on edge at the Death Star. Because when Vader walks in, you have no idea. You have no way to predict it. That in and of itself leads to neurotic-like symptoms. All right, any questions on that so far? All right, so we talked about a few things, tying them back to this experimental neurosis. Last one, again, curious case of Robert Pattinson. So what happened in 3 years that took him from this to this? And this is just an application of this. So if you're a fan, don't, you know what? Put in any innovations and suggestions if you're a fan. But I think it was Kristen Stewart. So Kristen Stewart is infamous for her ability to make this and only this facial expression. So I tried to get into Twilight when it first came out. That's like right up my alley. I love those types of movies. I didn't because, again, this is my opinion, I think it's just a bad movie. Like, it just made the way, it's just, anyways. But I was, I didn't really experience Kristen Stewart's acting until I watched Snow White and the Huntsman, right? And in Snow White and the Huntsman, and I'm not, this 100% happened, I found myself getting anxious while watching Snow White and the Huntsman. And I thought back to experimental neurosis, because in Snow White and the Huntsman, there's a facial expression for one situation, there's a facial expression for another situation, there's the same facial expression in another situation. So you can't, is she happy? Is she sad? Is she in love? Is she in danger? Is she angry? What is it? And I just found myself throughout that movie kind of being like, just kind of feel a little on edge here. And, I'm not the only one who thinks this. So this is the other, the Kristen Stewart emotional chart. And, there it is. So just like Vader, it's the same kind of situation. So, what does this have to do with Robert Pattinson? Well, again, facial expressions. They're very, very important. And we learn facial expressions throughout our lives. So, when you were a child, all right, so this goes all the way back to when you're a child, and you'll notice that little children, they will look at their parents a lot when they're first venturing out into the world. One of the things they're doing is they're learning about what's safe and what's not. So what's going to happen is they're going to be doing something that is fun, or they're going to be presented with an unconditioned stimulus that is fun. So they're going to be playing with the dog. You know, let's say the dog is all cuddly and friendly to children, and they're having a great time. And what they're going to do is they're going to look at their parents. They're going to check in with their parents. And what they're going to see is they're going to see a smile. So you got a smile, the neutral stimulus, that is being paired with fun, the unconditioned stimulus, that is causing happiness, the unconditioned response. Also, during that formative years, during that time, you learn what a frown means. So if there's another dog, and this dog is growling, and it's got foam coming out of its mouth, and the little child is going up to that other dog, and all of a sudden it looks, you know, at their parents, they're going to see a frown. They'll probably even see a grimace. And they'll say, oh, that's a frown, and that dog's going to run up to them and knock them over. That's not fun, and that's going to lead to fear. So this kind of checking in with your parents is one of the first ways that we learn what facial expressions mean. So we're having a good time. We take a look at our parents. The parents are smiling. Smile means is paired with the unconditioned stimulus of fun. That leads to happiness. We're having a horrible time. We just fell. We scraped our knee. We're crying. We look at our parents. The parents are like, hopefully not smiling. Our parents are like, oh no. And that leads to, oh, okay, frown, unconditioned stimulus of pain. That leads to the unconditioned response of fear. So eventually, a smile leads to the conditioned response of happiness. A smile actually becomes a conditioned stimulus that leads to the conditioned response of happiness. And you've seen this. When people smile, you feel better. You want to improve somebody's day, give them a smile, right? They say those things. So that's what happens when a smile becomes a conditioned stimulus. And then a frown becomes a conditioned stimulus that causes the conditioned response of fear. So if you see somebody frowning, you know something is wrong. Like you start to feel a little anxious, right? Especially depending on who it is. If you see your friend frowning, you're not going to feel happy. You're going to start feeling a little bit afraid and say, what is it? What's the issue? So that's very, very important to be able to discriminate between those emotions, because it helps you prepare for either a good time or prepare for something where fear is going to be of benefit. So, what happened when he was dating Kristen Stewart? Well, when he was dating Kristen Stewart, then he went through that same kind of conditioning. She had a facial expression that was paired with the unconditioned stimulus of fun. That led to the unconditioned response of happiness. So when they went out and they were having a wonderful time, maybe they went on vacation to the Bahamas, maybe it was in between shooting movies and they were just living it up. That was her facial expression, paired with fun, out in the sun, out on vacation, the unconditioned stimulus. That led to happiness, the unconditioned response. Let's say that they were going through some tough times. Let's say that they were having an argument and there was a shouting match. That is the unconditioned stimulus of not fun. That leads to the unconditioned response of fear. That was the conditioned stimulus that was being presented. So you can see where this is going. Those two are indistinguishable. It is very difficult to read those facial expressions. And if it's difficult to read those facial expressions, then when he sees this, he doesn't know, should my body prepare for a good time? Are we about to go out and have great news and wow, let's celebrate? Or should my body prepare for an argument? Should I kind of like hunker down and get ready? You don't know, because the conditioned stimulus cannot be discriminated against. And that's why he looked the way that he did in 2008, right? So that's just my application of the experimental neurosis. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying it's not true. You can make up your own ideas, but that is maybe one of the things that occurred, because if you cannot tell the difference between two facial expressions, those are difficult. Those people make you anxious. So as a kind of takeaway on this, I'll just mention, because I fully expect many of you, at some point in your career, you're going to be in charge of people, right? So you're going to be somebody's boss, you're going to be somebody's supervisor, you're going to be in charge of people that have to report to you. If you want to make a very pleasant environment. You don't have to change your personality. If you want to go hardcore, go hardcore. If you want to be happy-go-lucky, be happy-go-lucky. But definitely, to avoid this, make yourself easy to read. So if you're having, if you're going to be a hardcore boss, make your face hardcore. If you're having a bad day, don't be smiling. If you're having a good day, be smiling. If you're happy-go-lucky, be smiling, because that's going to make it a lot easier for your employees to be at ease and to be able to predict their situations rather than be working for Darth Vader and be in constant, not necessarily fear, but just constant agitation, constant anxiety, because you cannot predict, what's going to happen. All right, so that is experimental neurosis. Any questions about that? All right, so now we're going to tackle what is going on with the conditioned response. Sometimes the conditioned response is exactly the same as the unconditioned response. Sometimes the conditioned response is the complete opposite of the unconditioned response. So if before conditioning food, the unconditioned stimulus causes salivation, the unconditioned response, after conditioning, the bell that has become a conditioned stimulus now causes salivation, the conditioned response. Exactly the same behavior. On the other hand, we saw with Sniffy that a shock, the unconditioned stimulus, causes jumping, the unconditioned response, and then a tone, the neutral stimulus, causes no response, but when it becomes a conditioned stimulus because of conditioning and changes from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, now instead of causing jumping as a conditioned response, now it causes freezing. So it's the complete opposite of what the unconditioned response was. The tone now becomes a conditioned stimulus, causes a freezing conditioned response. So one possible explanation for this, one of the theories for what is going on, and we saw this in experimental neurosis, is that the conditioned stimulus is being used to prepare you for the unconditioned stimulus. Your conditioned stimulus is being used to get you ready for the unconditioned stimulus. Your conditioned stimulus is predicting that unconditioned stimulus, and therefore can go get you ready. And this is the basis of the preparatory response theory. So the preparatory response theory says that your conditioned response is getting you ready for your unconditioned stimulus. So this helps us to explain why sometimes it's the same and sometimes it's different. So let's take a look at for the case with the food. So in the case of food, it's going to be the same because salivation prepares this organism for food. So when you put food into the dog's mouth, the dog starts salivating. You don't have to teach it to do that. That's just a natural occurrence. When it hears the bell and has learned that the bell is going to cause food to be presented, after conditioning, that conditioned stimulus of the bell will get the dog ready for food. And one way to get the dog ready for food is to start salivating. Get your mouth ready, you're about to get some food. So it helps it prepare for that unconditioned stimulus. In the same way, sometimes in order to prepare for the unconditioned stimulus, you have to do the opposite of your unconditioned response. So for the shock, in this case, the tone is indicating that a shock is about to come, and for a shock, freezing is what prepares the organism for the shock. So remember that the unconditioned response is to jump. And if you were a rat or a mouse and you heard the tone and you just started doing that unconditioned response, by the time the shock came, you might be too tired. You might be done. You might be finished, right? However, on the other hand, if you heard that tone and you got ready to jump, what are you going to do when you're getting ready to jump? You're going to freeze. You're going to be like, when's it coming? I'm going to be ready to jump. you might start doing some stretches and this, whatever. But anyways, you're gonna freeze, you're gonna just stay there. So that is the preparatory response theory. So the purpose of the conditioned response isn't to replace the unconditioned response, it's to get the organism ready for the unconditioned stimulus. So the bell causes salivation because salivation gets you ready for the food. The tone causes the rat to freeze because freezing gets you ready to jump. And this is the way that we can explain why sometimes they're exactly the same and sometimes they're completely different. And this is also the reason why the conditioned response is called the conditioned response. We have to differentiate it from the unconditioned response because oftentimes it's going to be completely different. All right, any questions on that and that analysis? Make sense? All right. So the last thing we're going to do today is we're going to introduce the Little Albert study that was done by Watson and Rayner. So Watson of John Watson, the founder of behaviorism, did this study, and it was a classic case study of classical conditioning. And what they did, we'll see the details of what occurred. What they did is they saw if they could classically condition fear to a mouse in an infant, in baby Albert. So we're going to see a lot of the principles that we've been looking at in classical conditioning used in this particular video. The hammer is used to make a noise, not for any other purposes. So we're going to see classical conditioning used in this video. And then next class, we're going to delve into it in detail and just kind of highlight all the different sort of concepts that we've been looking at. So this is going to be kind of like the intro to the video so that we're familiar with it. And then next class, we're going to wrap it all up and take a look at what actually occurred. All right, so video is ready to go. And one of the things I love this video, partly I choose it for one reason. And this is a video that I found on YouTube that has the most footage from the actual Watson and Rayner Little Albert study. So it has, in terms of minutes, the most footage from the actual study. But I also love the fact that it is clearly done by a student. And I just like the idea that, students putting something out there that is so useful. So yeah, pretty cool, but away we go with the Little Albert experiment.
John G. Watson, known for establishing the behavior school of psychology, carried out one of the most influential psychology studies in the 1920s that was later on something that would never be forgotten. Classical conditioning, first experimented by Ivan Pavlov, was used on a dog when an unconditional stimulus was used to produce an unconditional response.
So I love that he calls it unconditional stimulus rather than the unconditioned stimulus. I mean, it's adorable.
An conditioned stimulus was used to produce a conditioned response. This was later on extended by Watson in his demonstration of the Little Albert experiment. In Watson's experiment, a little baby Albert was used to be conditioned. He was born to a woman who was a nurse in the Harriet Lane home of invalid children. Although raised in a hospital environment, Albert developed normally and was very stable. Ivan Pavlov was indeed able to condition the dog. Could Watson now do the same thing in humans? Now to the actual experiment itself. First off, Watson presented little Albert objects that he was not afraid of. Objects that Albert initially liked. These included fire, a monkey,
So you'll notice right there, just to kind of corroborate what I was talking about earlier when you're learning facial expressions, you'll notice that little Albert oftentimes looks from the animal that was just presented to him, or the fire that was presented to him, and he'll look at other individuals to try to gauge, you know, what's going on here. And again, that's one of the ways that you learn those facial expressions.
And finally, a white rat. Albert in particular likes the white rat. From all these clips, notice Albert's positive reactions. Now comes the conditioning. To start off the conditioning, when Albert reached to touch the rat, a loud bark was struck whenever Albert reached for the rat. Here, Albert first off fell forward and was startled, but he did not cry yet. But he reached for it for a second time and heard it, and then he started to cry. Watson had indeed conditioned a fear response in little Albert. Albert was then shown a rabbit. He immediately cried and got as far away as possible from it. Then a dog was also brought in. Albert did not cry right away. He was acting cautious, and it was only when the dog came right up to his head that he began to cry and tried to get away from it. After this, a seal fur coat was brought in. Albert turned away from it and was agitated. Then Watson used a Santa Claus mask, in which invoked an even more negative response by baby Albert. From the previous experience from the white rat.
So I hear some of the scoffs from the audience so there are criticisms to this. We will be addressing those. So one of them, I'm sure that most of you are thinking of right now, is who wouldn't be afraid of that, you know, Santa Claus mask. So keep that in mind. So we will be this. As influential as this study was, there are a lot of criticisms and a lot of alternative explanations for what's going on. So it's good that you were kind of thinking about that and picking up on it.
Little Albert suddenly became afraid of familiar objects that had the same characteristics as the white rat. This phenomenon was known as generalization. Watson then wanted to test whether the reaction would carry over in a different setting. The previous tests were done in a small dark room, but now he was brought into a larger room. He was presented with the same objects, but did not show strong symptoms of withdrawal until the objects were paired with a loud noise. Watson now wanted to see if fear could remain in Albert over a period of time. So Albert was brought home and returned in 1 month. When he returned, he was tested with the same objects and paired with the same loud noises. Albert indeed showed the same strong signs of withdrawal. Watson once again proved that he could condition fear into baby Albert. Watson concluded that phobias were most likely conditioned responses. The little Albert study is extremely important in psychology and other disciplines. It has inspired other important researchers of the past and continues to impact the direction of psychological investigation today. And the opponent process theory tells you about fear.
So you can listen to the song. The link is in the lecture notes if you so desire. All right, so that's a little Albert study. We're going to delve into more details on that, have a discussion about what exactly is going on in that next class. Any final questions on anything we covered today? Yep.
Just have you seen that scene from The Office where Jim conditions?
I know, I'm trying to remember. I watched The Office up to a point. Did Jim, who was it? Jim was did he condition White, probably?
Yeah. He like turned off his computer, like restart it, and he's like, hang on a minute. And then over time,
Oh, yeah. No, I do remember that. Yeah. And that, I mean, there's, so that idea of classically conditioning people, that's more, I think, operant conditioning, and we'll get to that because it's an actual behavior. But there's a urban legend. I've been trying to track down whether it's correct or whether it's not, but we'll kind of leave you with this story of the power of these learning principles that you're being exposed to, and how even knowing them, you cannot stop them. So, as the urban legend goes, and again, I've looked for corroborative evidence, I can't find it, but Skinner was at a conference, and they were having a discussion, and it was Skinner, and I think it was Maslow, the one that was like about the hierarchy, and there was like Abner, I think was one of the ones, was like humanistic psychology. Anyways, there was people that Skinner did not agree with. And one of them started talking, and Skinner literally just leaned next to his colleague and said, and goes, you know, watch this, I'm gonna make him shake his hand. So the guy starts talking, and he starts, you know, he's making points, right? So he's like, you know, and this is what I believe to be true. And every single time he did that, Skinner just did, and then he'd be like, and I believe this to be true. Skinner would be like this, right? And he gave that response every single time, and apparently by the end of the meeting, the guy was just like, and I think that, because through operant learning, that one behavior became much more prevalent. So these are very powerful things that are very easy to implement. If you notice on our syllabus, we spend the last week talking about ethics, because the last thing I want to do is teach everybody here all these powerful techniques and then unleash you upon the unsuspecting world. So we will talk about the importance of ethics as well. Unless, is there any other mentions? All right, so that's it for today.